Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in Forensic Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I am your instructor for this course. This week, we're going to dive into the fascinating intersection between neuroscience and psychology and law in forensic neuropsychology, because that really offers the tools to understanding how brain structures and functions influence behavior and cognition, and ultimately how individuals interact with the legal system. Now, before we start with the content here, I want you to just think about your own experiences. Perhaps a moment when you found yourself wondering about why people behave the way they do, or a news story that made you question the motivations behind criminal actions. Now, have you ever wondered how the brain injuries or mental health conditions impact decision making or impulse control? These kinds of questions are the things that we'll be exploring in today's lecture on forensic neuropsychology. And it's really fascinating to find out how the role of neurocognitive impairments can result in criminal behavior, and how this might play an impact on the ethics of sentencing someone with significant brain damage. Now, as always, I want to start off with a little story, and then we will dive into three main themes. The first theme that I want to explore in today's lecture is understanding how specific brain structures are linked to behavior, particularly those related to criminality and impulse control. So we're going to examine some areas like the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the limbic system, and their roles in decision making and aggression and impulse control. And we'll also, alongside the brain structure, we'll look at psychopharmacology. So the ways that medications such as antipsychotics or antidepressants or mood stabilizers impact cognitive functioning and behavior. Because these psychotropic drugs can significantly alter an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, and impulse control. We'll then take a little bit of time and look at psychometric tools in forensic neuropsychology. And here we'll look at some assessments that help us measure deficits that might be tied to things like brain injury or mental illness or neurodevelopmental disorders. So things like the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or even the Rorschach Inkblot Test. And finally, we'll explore the practical implications of forensic neuropsychology in the criminal justice system. And we'll take a little bit of time and look how neuropsychological assessments are used in criminal profiling, offering insights into the mental state of offenders and aiding in investigations. And we'll also examine how cognitive and emotional profiles are used to inform sentencing recommendations, especially when brain damage or mental illness or developmental delays are at play. And we'll explore how forensic neuropsychologists contribute to treatment programs in correctional facilities. And this includes designing rehabilitation programs for offenders with cognitive impairments, brain injuries, or other neuropsychological conditions, and monitoring their progress through treatment. Now, I want to start off with a little story about Dr. Muriel Lezak, born in 1927 in Chicago, Illinois. She went on and got her degree from the University of Chicago, and later on got her master's at Reed College and her PhD at the University of Portland. And early in her career, Lezak focused on cognitive assessments and the effects of brain injuries, which would later become the foundation for her groundbreaking work in neuropsychology. And Dr. Lezek's contribution to the fields are really kind of monumental. She did a lot of work on clinical assessments of brain injuries and cognitive impairments. And in 1976, she wrote a book called The Neuropsychological Assessment, which was a bit of a seminal work that has since become the standard reference text for both clinicians and researchers in the field. And the book provided a comprehensive framework for assessing cognitive functioning in individuals with brain injuries, neurodegenerative disorders, or neurological conditions, including those seen in forensic contexts. And her approach really emphasized the structure, the use of structured interviews and observations, and a wide range of neuropsychological tests to assess various cognitive domains such as memory and attention and language and executive function. And Lezek is also one of the most vocal and one of the first advocates for the importance of understanding real-world, everyday implications of cognitive impairment, not just their clinical presentations. Things like how it impacts emotions and personality and behavior, and how these factors can be seen within the forensic context. So Dr. Muriel Lezek's contributions to neuropsychology have been myriad, but she's really kind of pushed us to think about assessing brain damage and how that allows forensic neuropsychologists to provide courts with a more nuanced understanding of how brain injuries can affect how a person functions, their impulse control, their decision making, their moral reasoning, because all the things that we do as human beings are based upon the biology of our brain. So if there's damage to the biology of our brain, that's going to damage how we function and will lead to criminality. So let's dive in a little bit into our first theme. Forensic neuropsychology really is the application here of neuropsychological principles and methods to the legal context. And so this is going to involve how brain injuries and neurocognitive disorders and psychiatric disorders impact an individual's cognitive and emotional functioning, and how these impairments influence behavior really relevant to the legal issues. So in short, forensic neuropsychologists examine the relationship between brain function and behavior within the legal framework. So forensic neuropsychologists are often called upon to evaluate defendants and witnesses or plaintiffs in criminal and civil and family law cases. And their role is to provide scientifically backed insights into cognitive functioning and mental state, often determining whether brain injuries, neurological conditions, or psychiatric disorders may have played a role in criminal behavior, competency, or decision-making capacity. And in the legal context, forensic neuropsychologists fulfill a variety of roles, like criminal responsibility evaluations, looking at whether a brain injury or mental disorder diminish the individual's capacity to understand the nature or wrongfulness of their actions. So, for example, a defendant who has experienced traumatic brain injury may have impaired impulse control or impaired judgment, both of which are relevant in legal considerations of responsibility. They also look at competency to stand trial. They're looking at whether or not an individual is cognitively and emotionally capable of participating in their own defense. Do they have dementia or intellectual disabilities? That is obviously going to impact whether or not they're competent. There is sentencing and mitigating factors. So Forensic psychologists may provide input during the sentencing by assessing the cognitive impairments that could mitigate the severity of the sentence. So, for instance, if a neuropsychological evaluation reveals that a defendant has significant impairments due to a brain injury or neurodevelopmental disorder, this might be considered during sentencing as a factor reducing culpability. It can also be in civil cases. It can be in custody and family cases. It can be in expert testimony. So there's a wide scope of forensic neuropsychology. It really involves an interdisciplinary branch working with lawyers and psychologists and psychiatrists and neurologists and law enforcement to provide a really comprehensive understanding of how brain and behavior intersect in legal matters. So let's take a look at some key brain structures. This isn't a brain and behavior class or course, but there are some key things that I do want to kind of highlight here. Because neuropsychology really wants to examine how dysfunction or damage in certain areas of the brain can lead to problematic behavior, including criminal actions. And one of the most important ones, of course, is the prefrontal cortex, which involves higher order functioning, like decision making, impulse control, reasoning, and moral judgment. And it's essential for regulating behavior and emotions. Damage to the prefrontal cortex due to traumatic brain injury or neurodegenerative disorders or substance use even can lead to impulse and aggressive disorders. Can lead to poor decision making, can lead to a lack of regard for social rules, all of which are highly relevant in criminal cases. One of the most famous cases is that whole case of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker that suffered a traumatic brain injury when a metal rod pierced his skull and damaged his prefrontal cortex. Before, Phineas Gage was a calm, cool professional, very, very kind, very gentle. Afterwards, his personality was dramatically changed. He was impulsive, he was aggressive, he was socially inappropriate. And this is just a simple, famous case of how a brain injury can change someone. The amygdala, also, that small little almond-shaped structure located in the limbic system, is responsible for emotional processing, particularly fear and aggression. And hyperactivity or dysfunction in the amygdala is often linked to heightened aggression or impulsivity and violent behavior. And in forensic cases, overactive amygdala function can explain aggressive outbursts or impulsive violent behavior. And it plays a critical role in understanding the emotional regulation deficits seen in some offenders, particularly those with antisocial behavior or psychopathic traits. There's also the hippocampus. Okay? The hippocampus functions as your processing of memory, and at the end of that is your amygdala, which gives emotional weight to the memory. Your hippocampus is that primary association for memory formation and retrieval. And so damage to this structure can result in memory deficits, which may be relevant in cases where the defendant claims memory loss or disorientation during the commission of the crime. And memory impairments in defendants can complicate criminal cases, particularly when assessing the reliability of testimony, competency to stand trial, or claims of amnesia during criminal events. And then we have the limbic system, which is that whole structure working together of the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are parts of this. It's a whole network of structures involved in emotional regulation and in motivation. And it's really how we get into wanting to do something. And if you have emotional dysregulation or impulsivity or poor decision making, all of those become very relevant in criminal behavior. So when you have abnormalities in any of these structures, you're likely going to have some kind of criminal behavior, just as a matter of statistics. And when these brain regions are damaged or not functioning properly, individuals will inevitably exhibit behaviors that are risky and impulsive and sometimes outright criminal. There are cases of brain injury or neurodevelopmental disorders like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or ADHD, or neurological conditions like epilepsy or dementia that may be linked to criminal acts. I recall once lent my son a car, and he was working in a community, and a man came up and just started beating on his car, or my car, I guess, and pretty much destroyed it with a hunk of wood. And I was very upset at this and wanted criminal charges, and then later found out that, well, this individual had very profound neurodevelopmental disorders. And right there, it changes the whole nature of the event, because this person didn't really have the ability to control themselves in that way. So that would just be an example of that. Now, let's look at some real cases of well-documented cases of the role of brain structures. One notable case would be Charles Whitman, who was a former Marine who in 1966 committed a mass shooting at the University of Texas. And an autopsy revealed that Whitman had a tumor pressing against his amygdala, which may have contributed to his uncharacteristically violent behavior. This kind of abnormality can influence aggressive behavior. There's also the case of Aaron Hernandez, NFL player who was convicted of murder. And after his death, Hernandez was found to have advanced chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a neurodegenerative disease caused by repeated head trauma. And CTE, this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, affects the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, leading to symptoms like impulsivity, emotional instability, and aggression. And understanding how these brain structures really contribute to criminal behavior is essential for forensic psychologists as they assess the mental state of defendants and evaluate the degree which cognitive impairments may have influenced their actions. Because by linking brain dysfunction, observable, measurable brain dysfunction, to behavior, forensic neuropsychologists help courts make better informed decisions about responsibility, about sentencing, and about treatment. And so I also want to shift to focus on neurochemistry and the neurochemical and neurotransmitter systems, because these also underlie behavior and cognition. They're essential components of neuropsychology. So understanding how disruptions in neurochemistry can lead to behavioral changes, impulsivity, and criminal acts, this really provides key insights into the biological underpinnings of criminality. So there are some neurotransmitters, which are chemical messengers that facilitate the communication between neurons in the brain, regulate different brain functioning, like regulating mood, like impulse control, like decision making and behavior. And there are some key ones that we need to be mindful of. The first one is 5-HT, or serotonin. Now, serotonin is primarily responsible for regulating mood. It tells you to chill out. It tells you that things are safe, and it gives impulse control. And low levels of serotonin are commonly linked to increased aggression, irritability, impulsivity, and emotional instability. Because you feel threatened, you literally feel fear, and you feel like the world is a dangerous place. So individuals with low serotonin levels will often have this kind of feeling. And if it's combined with other dysfunctions, there can be low or impulse control. Dopamine plays a significant role in the reward processing, so motivation. That we do things because we want dopamine. We like things because we like dopamine. But if we have low dopamine, we can lack pleasure, and that also slows down our cognitive reasoning. So the reward system is driven by dopamine, and this can push individuals toward engaging in high-risk behaviors, including criminal acts, particularly when that dopamine system is being impacted by substance use or addiction. Because there's this drive for immediate gratification. We don't ever really make decisions or do actions without dopamine. So if you think about that basic principle, nothing we do without dopamine can lead to a reasoning why people will engage in theft or robbery or violent outbursts because of dopamine. Individuals with psychosis as well exhibit dopaminergic dysregulation, which contributes to their cognitive distortions and delusional thinking. So that also might be something that's at play. Then there's norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is involved in arousal and attention. So disruptions in norepinephrine can make a person irritable and prone to aggressive outbursts. Also GABA, so gamma aminobutyric acid, that calms down the nervous system. So if you are, say for example, if you are drinking a lot of alcohol, over a period of time that disrupts your GABA system and makes you more likely to feel anxiety or feel impulsive or aggressive. And glutamate. Imbalances in glutamate are associated with mood disorders and schizophrenia and neurodegenerative disorders like mood dysregulation and violent outbursts as well. So there's a lot of things within the neurochemical side that can impact impulse control and behavior, as well as our thinking processes. When you have a disruption, say for example, reduced serotonin and excessive dopamine, this can impair cognitive functioning and can lead to, say for example, substance dependence. Impulse control is heavily influenced by neurochemical activities, particularly serotonin and dopamine. So low serotonin or elevated dopamine levels can reduce the ability of the brain to inhibit impulsive actions. So this can make someone very reckless or violent. So you can see there are a lot of things that go on with neurochemistry. And this has a role to play for the neuropsychologist when you're thinking about things like competency to stand trial. Neurochemical disruption can impair cognitive and emotional functioning and make it difficult for a defendant to comprehend legal proceedings. And it may make them unable or impaired in taking the stand. It might also have an impact on criminal responsibility. Someone that has serotonin deficiencies or chronically excessive dopamine may not have full control over their behavior. And this might also have sentencing factors and mitigating factors related to impulse control or cognition. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and explore a little bit of neuropsychological assessments, because neuropsychological assessments really allow the forensic neuropsychologist to measure an individual's cognitive abilities, their psychological functioning, and their personality traits. And these tools help to more objectively quantify impairments that can be caused by brain injuries, mental health disorders, or developmental conditions. So we try to provide an unbiased and quantifiable way of measuring cognitive deficits, and this then helps provide some expert testimony within court. So it helps determine cognitive impairment like memory loss, poor executive function, or attention deficits. It can help to identify psychiatric conditions. And when assessing a personality, using a battery of tests to evaluate the emotional and psychological functioning of an individual. There's also IQ tests and memory tests that are used, and executive functioning tests, which are particularly important because executive function is examining the role of the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe. If there's damage to the frontal lobe or other psychiatric conditions, a person can exhibit poor decision making, poor planning, poor impulse control, and problem solving. So all of that can, again, play into evaluating criminal responsibility, assessing competency to stand trial, detecting malingering. Malingering is the intentional faking of symptoms, and that can be a common issue in forensic cases. So neuropsychological tests include tools that are designed to detect someone who's faking it. And this ensures that defendants can't easily deceive the legal system about the extent of their cognitive or psychological deficits. And all of this provides a guide for sentencing and treatment. So I want to just talk a little bit about the MMPI because that's one of the key tools, and then we'll talk a little bit about some others as well. The MMPI is a standardized psychometric tool used to assess personality structure and psychopathology. It has less than between 500 and 600 true and false items. And this produces a score on a lot of different clinical scales to measure a lot of different mental health disorders and emotional functioning and personality traits. And in forensic settings, the MMPI, or I guess more accurately the MMPI-2, helps in identifying personality disorders or an issue of emotional stability or malingering, that is the faking or exaggeration of symptoms, as well as other psychological issues that might be relevant to the case. Another tool is the Rorschach. Now, this isn't as popular as it once was, but this was something that was established by the Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach in 1921 as a method for exploring unconscious processes and personality traits. And it really just consists of 10 standardized ink blots. And a person is asked to describe what they see in the ambiguous ink blots, and their responses are then analyzed. And I have a shelf full of different systems for this. One of the biggest is an attempt to take what is, because the Rorschach is called something known as a projective test, meaning that it provides an unstructured stimulus that allows individuals to project their own thoughts. feelings, and personality characteristics on the images. And the responses are then analyzed using an established scoring system. And something known as the Exner Comprehensive System is an attempt to make this a little bit more objective in the scoring. So it attempts to reduce the interpretation of it. But it's designed in a way to look at things like cognitive organization and emotional regulation. And there are other tools that are more objective, like the MMPI or the WACE, that are used. But sometimes things like the Rorschach are really valuable for evaluating whether an individual, whether their thought processes are disorganized, whether they have reality distortion, whether characterized by perceptual disturbances, delusional disorders, schizophrenia, that sort of thing. But it can also be a good tool for bringing out, things like narcissism or antisocial tendencies or borderline features. And it can also be helpful to detect attempts to fake or exaggerate symptoms, which is a common concern in forensic evaluations. Because the test is very unstructured, and it's difficult to manipulate, and individuals attempting to deceive forensic experts often struggle to provide consistent and credible responses. Now, how do we apply all of this neuropsychology? Well, one of the first ways is by criminal profiling. And this involves the behavioral, the cognitive, and the psychological data that we gather to create a profile of an unknown offender. Now, while profiling is often associated with law enforcement, forensic neuropsychologists really do contribute to profiling by focusing on the neurocognitive aspects of behavior. In particular, they assess how cognitive impairments and brain injuries or neurological conditions can influence criminal behavior. So it provides insights into identifying things like cognitive deficits of an offender. What might be the personality traits like impulsivity or antisocial tendencies, which may predispose a person to certain types of crime. And so the role of neuropsychology in understanding the mental state of the offender can be very valuable in determining their level of criminal responsibility. Forensic neuropsychologists evaluate the cognitive and emotional functioning of individuals who commit crimes to determine whether mental illness or brain injury or cognitive impairments contribute to their actions. And defendants with severe psychiatric disorders, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, may experience distorted thinking, hallucinations, or delusions that affect their judgment. They may also be impaired impulse control, which is a very common factor in criminal cases. And neuropsychological assessments of impulse control can reveal whether an offender had the ability to regulate their behavior or whether cognitive impairments contributed to the crime. So, we're going to take a little bit of time now and just kind of go over a little bit of some key terms that we brought up in this lecture. And one of the first ones is criminal responsibility. And of course, this is where an individual's capacity to understand the nature and wrongfulness of their actions at the time of the crime was committed. So in the context of forensic neuropsychology, what we do here is we assess the cognitive functioning, the mental illness, the brain injuries, and all of that is used to determine whether an offender had the ability to form intent or control their behavior during the criminal act. In terms of malingering, if you remember, is the intentional exaggeration or the fabrication of psychological or cognitive symptoms. And often this is done to avoid legal consequences. In forensic neuropsychology, tools like the MMPI-2, for example, are used to detect malingering, and this ensures that defendants can't be manipulating the assessments to appear more impaired than they actually are. So you're not faking the mental illness and thereby avoiding criminal responsibility. And then impulse control. And impulse control refers to the brain's ability to regulate and inhibit spontaneous actions or aggressive behaviors. And forensic neuropsychologists assess impulse control in individuals to determine whether cognitive impairments, such as those resulting from brain injuries or mental illness, contribute to impulsiveness in criminal behavior. So, if I were to ask the question, which area of the brain is most associated with impulse control, and damage to this region may lead to impulsive, aggressive behavior in individuals with a history of criminal activity. So if we damage a certain part of the brain that would likely lead to impulsive, aggressive behavior, what would it be? And it would probably be the prefrontal cortex, that part just behind our forehead, because that is our higher order cognitive functioning. It's responsible for our decision making, our moral reasoning, and our impulse control. So damage to this region can impair our ability to regulate emotions and behavior, and this leads to impulsive or aggressive actions. So, as a final thought, when we are exploring this whole field of forensic psychology, I encourage you to think critically about how neurocognitive and psychological factors shape behavior in ways that are not always immediately visible. I want you to consider how advances in neuroscience and psychology will continue to inform legal processes, whether that be from profiling and criminal responsibility assessment to rehabilitation and treatment. And in the midst of that, I hope that you understand and remember that we all are dependent upon our biology, whether that be our brain structure and the health of that brain structure, or the neurochemistry and the balance of that neurochemistry. It all impacts all of us. How we function, how we think, how we make decisions, and how we live. So remember that disruptions to that can have an impact on any of us. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.